Focus in on 54, Lee McNeil in the middle. Just watch the athleticism. Oh, man. All over Dak. And here he comes again. Just so much force up the middle. Oh, wow. The Philadelphia Eagles followed a very familiar formula to win themselves a Super Bowl. For the Detroit Lions, there's already been a ton of turnover this offseason, and no doubt that injuries took a chunk from their defensive talent. But they're going to have to follow a similar plan. Welcome back to the channel. I am your host, Johnny Gaz. Thank you for returning for another video. With the Super Bowl now behind us, let's get back into the positional breakdowns. We'll take a look at the most important position group for the Detroit Lions this offseason, that defensive line. In this video, we'll take a look at the current depth chart. I'll look at those free agents both internally and the external targets that could be out there. We'll talk about the draft strategy and ultimately answer the question how the Detroit Lions can build a dominant defensive line. Let's go. It is said over and over that the NFL is a copycat league, and we're all victims of recency bias. The Philadelphia Eagles won Super Bowl 59 on the strength of their front four, that defensive line. They didn't even have to blitz 90% of the time because of the pressure they're able to generate from the four players up front. That allowed their secondary to sit back and make plays. And along with a great performance from their quarterback, Jalen Hurts, the Eagles stopped the three-peat from happening from the Kansas City Chiefs on the strength of a dominant defensive line. And for the Lions, coming into last season, they were already searching for a running mate to Aiden Hutchinson. Unfortunately, they brought in Marcus Davenport, who ended up on injured reserve, along with several other players. At one point in time, the Lions had 18 defensive players on injured reserve, highlighted by the major leg injury to Aiden Hutchinson week 5 against Dallas. The situation really became unrecoverable. The Lions had to get very exotic with their blitz packages to try and create pressure, but it really left a lot of players on islands, and they were relying on second, third, and fourth string players towards the end of the season. And going into the playoffs, it was a major factor in why they lost in the divisional round to the Washington Commanders. So let's take a look at the Detroit Lions depth chart on the defensive line. We will work under the assumption that the players currently on injured reserve will be back at full strength. We'll look at the free agents, and we'll see where the Lions can go from here to build this dominant defensive line. Here is the Lions' current depth chart. Let's focus in on the defensive line, and you have to start with Aiden Hutchinson. The word was that if the Lions had gotten to a Super Bowl, that he would have been able to play. So you have to assume with additional rehab and an entire offseason that he will come back full strength. The question for the Lions is, what do they do with his contract? Now, they can extend a fifth-year option and wait, but if he comes back and ends up being the defensive player of the year that he was showing in those first several weeks, then that contract would just go up, up, and up. So what do the Lions do with that contract and his salary as we head into 2025? We shall see. Marcus Davenport, the Lions brought in last offseason to try and be that running mate to Aiden Hutchinson. Unfortunately, after a few weeks, he also ended up on injured reserve and did not return. So the Lions just aren't sure what they would have gotten out of Marcus Davenport, and this has now developed into a habit for him in his injuries. So the question is, do the Lions decide to bring him back again, take another risk? I think it would have to be on a one-year ultimate prove-it deal, even less than what they brought him in on last year. If he's able or wanting to do that, then I think the Lions could go ahead and make that deal as they look for other options on the defensive line. Josh Pascal finished as the starter for the Lions there in the playoffs because of all the other injuries, and I don't know if he produced as much as the Lions would have liked him to, but is that a product of his talent, or is it because of all of the other injuries and his just not getting the right opportunity? Because if you add more talent to the defensive line and he plays the depth piece that I think he was more meant for, he might be more productive. Ultimately, he's returning. He is under contract, and the Lions will hope to get more out of him this upcoming season. The other starter is Darius Smith. Interesting case. The Lions brought him in midseason last year, hoping to make up for the injuries and the loss of Aiden Hutchinson. And again, I think he's another victim of all the other injuries defensively, where he's just not able to produce because the defense is able to zone in on what he was trying to do. He is ultimately under contract coming back in the next season, but is owed a lot of money. And the question for the Lions is, are they willing to pay him that money for what may be a lack of production. Right now, the way I see his contract shaking out, I think the Lions may look to move on. John Kaminsky, a guy that did not play a snap in 2024-25. The Lions really like him, and he was productive for them in past seasons. But because of now the injury last year, they're not exactly sure what they'll get from him down the road. He is a free agent entering this offseason, but the Lions will need to have reliable depth pieces, and that's a guy that they typically can count on if he can remain healthy. Then you have guys like El Kadim Muhammad, Mitchell Agude, and Jonah Williams also still on the active roster, although you don't see him here. Those are all unrestricted free agents. A guy like El Kadim Muhammad produced, I thought, well in kind of being thrust into more snaps than he would typically get, and I think that's a guy the Lions will look to bring back. Agude and Williams, I think, will sort of be a product of what other moves the Lions make this offseason. Now let's move to the inside, starting with defensive tackle Alim McNeill, who was really turned into a game wrecker there before going out against Buffalo, and he did not return and, of course, didn't play in the playoff game. And I think that was kind of the nail in the coffin for the Lions defense. When you lost Alim McNeill, I mean, he was able to generate a lot of pressure up front, which caused the guys around him to look better and able to do more things. And when he goes out, everything just kind of fell apart. So you hope that Alim McNeill is able to get through this offseason, get a full recovery, rehab. I mean, this might be a guy that, might not even be able to start at the beginning of next season. So I think that is a main priority for them is his rehab, getting him back. They just gave him a new contract, so he signed through 2028. And when healthy, he can be a game changer. And along with Aiden Hutchinson and hopefully what will be some other moves here, that's sort of your basis for what should be a dominant defensive line. DJ Reader, kind of in a similar case to Zadarius Smith, where does the production match what he will ultimately be paid next season? He's also under contract, but he's owed a lot more money than I think he might be worth, and that could be another guy the Lions look to cut. It will, again, depend on what other moves they make, what happens in the draft. I'm not saying DJ Reader doesn't have more productive seasons ahead of him, but is he worth what his contract will dictate at this time? And that's really the question for the Lions this offseason. Levi Onwuzurike might be the toughest one to call here for the Lions, and ultimately another guy that may have suffered from the other injuries that surrounded him, and you just didn't get enough production. He's one of the Brad Holmes draft picks that really just hasn't given you enough since day one. I think because of that, he's probably a guy as an unrestricted free agent that ends up leaving the Lions this offseason. And again, I think that's solely based on the fact that with given finally an opportunity with a full season, he stayed relatively healthy. It just wasn't enough, and they needed it from him this year. Mekhi Wingo, they also lost to injured reserve, another draft pick that I think they're hoping to get a lot more out of next season. So his recovery, his rehab, making sure he comes back, I think will be vital, because he is obviously going to be with the organization for several years down the road and would like to see him build into something. Kyle Peko, kind of on the opposite end, a guy that is an unrestricted free agent. A lot will depend on what else they do on the defensive tackle side, but they like the experience that Kyle Peko brings. He was very productive for the Lions, so that could be a guy they bring back if the price is right. Miles Adams was another late season addition to make up for all of the injuries, and I think he fit the scheme well. But again, as a restricted free agent, what do the Lions really want to do with him? But he could be a guy that ultimately leaves the organization because of hopefully some additional pieces that the Lions will bring onto this defensive line. Then you have also already under contract Broderick Martin, and I think he's also been sort of a disappointment to this point. Again, he was a guy that was healthy, but still didn't get a ton of opportunity, even with all of the injuries defensively, and that sort of tells you everything you need to know from 2024-25. But again, he is under contract, so we'll see what the Lions get out of him this offseason, OTAs, training camp. Does he start to improve? Does he show himself more? He's a mountain of a man, and I'm sure they would love to have him more involved, but we shall see. After looking at the depth chart, it appears clear the Lions need to bring in some additional pieces to this defensive line if they're ultimately going to build a dominant front four. And I've talked about this in the past, and I'm just going to say this up front. As much as I would love to see the Lions pursue and get Myles Garrett or a guy like Max Crosby, I just don't think it's in the cards. The organization really doesn't make that sort of move, and I believe the price tag will just be too high. Again, I'm not saying that I would not love Myles Garrett opposite of Aiden Hutchinson, or that I don't think that Brad Holmes should make an attempt or put together an offer that they think is fair in that case. But you have to remember other teams are going to be seeking their services, and I just believe that the price point, the asking, is going to be way too much for what the Lions organization is willing to give under their current cultural philosophy. So with all that being said, let me give a few options on how the Lions can move forward and look outside of the organization to bolster their defensive line. And maybe the Lions don't make the huge splash move, but I still think there's many players out there the Lions could bring in to bolster this defensive line and be truly effective opposite Aiden Hutchinson. One being on the edge, Khalil Mack. And I know he's at the tail end of his career, but even over the past 2 seasons, he's been a very effective pass rusher. The Lions wouldn't bring him in to be an every down edge. He's really going to come in and just be truly everything that I think he wants to be, is a situational pass rusher, a guy that can just get after the quarterback. And Aiden Hutchinson will eat up all the double teams, so he's going to be free to do what he wants. And I think that just creates a great situation for not only Khalil Mack, but the Detroit Lions. I don't believe that he'd be coming in on a break-the-bank situation. I think he's looking for a very short-term deal. He wants to be on a winner, and the Lions are set up to win. Another guy I would say to look out for on the edge is Malcolm Kuntz, coming from the Las Vegas Raiders. Here's why I bring him to the table. The Lions seem to have a track record of finding guys coming off of injuries, and this guy was productive prior to his injury. He's also coming off of a situation where he wasn't injured late in the season, so he's going to have another full off season to recover. He's probably going to want a short-term deal on a prove-it situation and probably give you everything that you could want. Lions have brought in guys from the Raiders. You look at Amik Robertson coming into this situation and sort of having a resurgence. I could see something like that with Malcolm Kuntz. Now, he's a little bit smaller on the edge for what I think the Lions look for, let's say in comparison to Marcus Davenport or Khalil Mack, who we just mentioned. But I just think the stars kind of align for his situation, his production, versus what I think the Lions could get him for. So if the Lions are looking for the prototypical size and a guy that they can kind of build into what they need there on the opposite edge of Aiden Hutchinson, how about looking at someone from the Indianapolis Colts, Dayo Odeyingbo? And I apologize if I'm butchering that name, but he is a huge man, 6'6", and I think kind of fits the opposite build of Aiden Hutchinson and what they need there. So, again, not maybe a name you've heard, but I think a guy that has steadily gotten better and better. And I think the Lions like doing business with the Indianapolis Colts. And again, there's a situation where you're not going to have to pay an arm and a leg for this particular player. And if it's a name that you're looking for, I would steer you back towards Chase Young, who had a very productive year with the New Orleans Saints there, coming from San Francisco. And he's not your main guy anymore. He's not going to be a Defensive Player of the Year candidate for you. But I think opposite Aiden Hutchinson and some other pieces you have in the line, he could be very effective. And again, that's another guy. It would not be a long-term deal. It'd probably be a little bit more money than maybe the Lions are comfortable with. But there's going to be a situation where you might have to pay someone here. Now, I'm saying if you're not going to go max contract with the Crosby situation, the Myles Garrett situation, this is where maybe you extend a little bit more money and bring in a player you know has name, has production, and really might make a difference for the Lions' defensive line. And if the Lions would rather go much younger, they could look to the New York Giants and Azeez Ojulari, who's only 24 years old, really a pass rushing specialist, and he's again on the smaller side of things. So maybe not the prototypical size and strength that you want on the opposite end of Aiden Hutchinson, but again, a guy that might even grow into his body a little bit more, somebody you can mold. And again, another team the Lions like doing business with, the New York Giants. And on top of that would be another guy that you don't have to break the bank for. I think Lions like guys that they can mold, they can fit into the culture, and I think this is one of those pieces. And on the interior, it really depends on what the Lions want to do with DJ Reader. Do they bring him back? Because if they do and they're happy with that, him combined with Aleem McNeil is a good force. But DJ Reader, I think, is injury prone. I don't know if the production is going to continue to go up. Certainly not going to go up So do the Lions then cut ties? And if they do, I don't know that they're going to invest major dollars on a second defensive tackle. So I think then you see them going after probably another veteran presence later in the career, guys that want to win, can get them on short-term deals. You know, I see a guy like B.J. Hill, even from the Cincinnati Bengals, who was a running mate of DJ Reader in previous seasons. He's a free agent this year, so the Lions could look there. Calais Campbell, who the Lions had talked about in previous seasons. So you have guys like that I think the Lions could really look into if they decide to move away from DJ Reader. And then, of course, you have to look to the draft, and it's kind of been hit and miss on the defensive line for Brad Holmes. He certainly hit on guys like Aiden Hutchinson, but you could say was a miss on a guy like Live Onwuzurike or Broderick Martin. So this particular draft is very important. We know the Lions will be picking pick number 28 and later on in the draft because of where they finished this season. So they're really going to have to pinpoint particular players and hit on guys if they're going to be picking later on. Do they ultimately use some of those picks to go get other guys in free agency this offseason? And does that limit what they then can do in the draft? I still have a lot of faith in Brad Holmes, and I think he will use those picks wisely in an effort to bolster what I think will be a dominant defensive line. So do they look to add to the interior or the edge with a young player there to build behind some of those established players that the Lions will have on the defensive line? And again, a lot of this will depend on the injuries, guys that come back from injured reserve, ultimately their rehab and their effectiveness as they get back into the lineup. There's a lot of what ifs for this Detroit Lions as they head into the 2025 season, but I think the picture is clear. They need to get healthy and they need to improve their defensive line. That's going to do it for today's video. What do you guys think? How did the Lions build a dominant defensive line? Do they have good bones for it right now? What players do they have to go out and get in free agency to make this thing what it needs to be to win a Super Bowl? Let me know in those comments down below. If you dig the vibe here at Johnny Gas Sports, please hit that like button. It's the best free way to help out the channel. I'd also love it if you consider subscribing. We're on the road to 3,000 subscribers now, thanks to you guys. And if you hit the notify bell, you won't miss any future videos. I do have a membership option available. That's where I do all my live game play-by-play reactions, highlight stuff, a ton of other fun content. But there is always free stuff here for you all the time. More than anything else, make sure to take care of yourself and that mental health. That is more important than anything, and I want to make sure you come back and see me on future videos. I appreciate all your time. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. Go Lions.